Welcome to this edition of the Capital Brief. I'm Seth Berensweig here in the lovely BL Media podcast studio in downtown Tysons, Virginia. Back here with our colleague and friend, John Tamny. John, how are you today?
I'm great. Good to be back.
Good, good. Hopefully you're avoiding the cicadas.
I just don't think about them. I choose to believe they don't exist.
Well, good man. That's
Yes.
the smart path. I'm just trying to avoid looking at them, and frankly, since that's not a fun topic, we will move on. On a much better and much more fascinating topic, John, I would like to talk with you today about a really cool article, your most recent article that I read in Forbes, entitled "Big Tech Risks Going Down a Path of Decline Paved by, quote, Big Rail." Great article, really enjoyed it, raises some interesting big tech reg questions. Talk to me about it. What is the thesis of your article? Give us kind of a big picture summary of that, and let's just use that as a door to talk about what I think is a really important issue.
Well, the thesis is, first of all, that the future of commerce is anything but knowable. And so when you found a business on your own, you're making a big statement that you have a belief about where things are heading. So successful business to me is a remarkable thing. It's an achievement. It's something to celebrate.
Hard work.
Hard work, and just in something really you've discovered an unmet market need. And so when I see a big fortune made in business, I celebrate it as a momentous, miraculous achievement, because you've discovered that something that market actors had no idea existed. Because if they had any idea of how important it was, they would have already done it.
Right.
And so it's really something to think about. Now, the challenge with these big fortunes is that they generate attention, and they sometimes generate unwanted attention. Let's call big rail, let's call the railroads of the 19th century, the Silicon Valley of their era, a truly transformative vision that we're going to shrink the United States
coast to coast
in a figurative sense, by connecting it with these rails. And so people made enormous fortunes. The Vanderbilt, Johns Hopkins, Collis Huntington, Leland Stanford. We see these fortunes to this day around the country, these names. But what happens is you generate attention. In particular, you generate Washington attention. They want a piece of this. They want to regulate it. They see ways for them to be involved. This is what happened with Big Rail long ago, and it set the stage for its decline. When you are regulated, you are suddenly blinded to market realities, and market realities hit you hard. And so my concern is that big tech presently is the next line of, it's the next Silicon Valley.
The next regulatory target, if you will.
When you make a lot of money, you're the regulatory target, and it worries me that big tech is too willing to accept the regulation that Big Rail did long ago.
And we'll definitely talk about that aspect in a minute, because whoever would have imagined that Facebook would be putting out articles that says, or not only articles, but also commercials that say, hey, think about new regulation for Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. I mean, it's actually something where they're anticipating that something's going to be happening, where for years they were saying that they didn't want it to happen. But in any event, just to kind of close the factual loop on that, how would you explain to our viewers how Big Rail declined? I mean, I can volunteer my experience on Amtrak. The guys that work on Amtrak, the folks that are the conductors and people that work there are certainly awfully nice people, but Amtrak is not a model of efficiency. So in a quick snapshot, when you say the decline of Big Rail, can you just explain briefly, what do you mean by that?
Well, so Big Rail, again, was this enormously profitable concept that took the business world by storm, and then suddenly in the late 19th century, you have the Interstate Commerce Commission.
Right.
Suddenly, light touch regulating the rail industry. We're going to get involved in fees you can charge. But government is a bureaucracy always in search of a mission. And so it went from a light touch regulation to, well, we have some idea about how you'll serve your customers, and since government is constrained by the known, since they always view what exists today as the frontier of advance, hey, wait, if this is successful for the Vanderbilts and the Huntingtons, why doesn't government get involved with this? Think of all the jobs we can create. So suddenly this light touch regulator is now a competitor of yours.
A solution in search of a problem.
Yes, always, always, always. So once you have that, whereas in the private sector you're rewarded for doing more and more with less and less human input, the opposite takes place with government, such that suddenly there are a lot more employees in government regulating and competing with big rail in a lot of ways. What does that do? It shrinks the industry. It makes it less dynamic because suddenly there's limits on what you can do, how much you can innovate. And so as a consequence, where's the talent going to do? The talent's not going to go to what is stodgy. It's going to find somewhere else. And so once talent is pushed out of an industrial space, mediocrity is going to follow.
I've been to the Rail Museum in Baltimore, and there are a few things in the Rail Museum that aren't dramatically different than things that are running today on the rails. So when you talk about creativity and ingenuity, I found your article to be really, really interesting. Taking that concept of the regulators coming in and just throwing in a blanket of regulatory mediocrity, let's throw that right into the pool of big tech. When I read your article, my mind started thinking about two topics: bad regulation and good regulation. In terms of bad regulation, we've seen a number of things happening from Washington, D.C. over just the last few months, and frankly, even during the last couple of weeks. You see these drama sessions on Capitol Hill with high drama and theatrics with the House and Senate committees talking to big tech, continuing to drag down these big tech CEOs. And when they have these people in the room or on Zoom or whatever the government uses, rather than using it as an opportunity for thoughtful analysis and what can be done to help work with and, for example, have a public-private partnership with big tech, you end up with these drama moments such as Ted Cruz telling Dorsey from Twitter, who elected you chief of content control, which makes for a nice soundbite, but is just clueless and useless. So, when you talk about examples of the government in day-to-day real action that raises genuine questions such as the ones that you raise, I think about that every time I watch most of these congressional hearings. Another example of what I would put under the category of bad regulation is DOJ's attempt to try to go after big tech with the antitrust hammer. And the reason why I think that that's a bad idea is because you take a statute that literally hasn't been materially changed since the 1890s, and you're trying to apply it to the most sophisticated technology companies today, including instances where companies like Google and Facebook have been criticized and attacked by the government for acquiring companies that supposedly make them a monopoly that were reviewed and approved by the federal government, and then they turn around and then they sue the very same companies for the mergers that the government approved. So, what can you give another example, or have you seen anything over the last couple of months of this example of what happened with the vilification of the so-called robber barons, right? Because then they became the bad guys, and a regulator never met something that he or she didn't want to regulate. What have you seen in with our friends in Washington in terms of them getting their hands on big tech to actually make this trip to mediocrity happen that goes right to the concern that you wrote about in Forbes?
Well, I'll give an example that's just so obnoxious for what it says about government that happened just this week. It's somewhat along the same lines, but Senator Josh Hawley, a vocal critic of big tech, what does he put out on Twitter? I'm excited to report that my new book is #1 on Amazon. So again, he despises Twitter, he despises Amazon, yet the very entity that he despises is the one that's conferred bestseller status on his book.
Right.
And so it tells you something about what big tech is up against. They are up against people who, once they succeed, again, want a piece of it, want to be involved. And once you give them that piece of it, once you say, you know, we're kind of okay with regulation,
Right.
you are setting the stage. And can you blame them? Can you
Right.
blame them for thinking, we don't need this, they're not going to stop, so let's let them have their
Right.
ability to run what we do.
Right.
But that sets the stage, and it speaks to the problem of regulation broadly.
Right.
The only good regulation is the marketplace, and the reason for that is the marketplace provides competition. The fear of losing market share is the ultimate regulator. Now, what government is promising is we will have more control over your industry, but we will limit new entrants. We will block it. Mark Zuckerberg.
We'll make it harder for them, barriers to entry.
Barriers to entry. Mark
Right.
Zuckerberg is suddenly cool with regulation. Well, yet wouldn't he be? Let's never forget that News Corp owned MySpace. He vanquished it. Remember when Friendster was a big deal?
Right.
What an exciting thing to keep out what is going to put Facebook out to pasture. It seems interesting, but then let's not forget, it's the fear of the new entrant that forces you to be creative. It was a miracle that you got to where you were. And once you keep out that dynamism, you're keeping the very talent out of your industry that's going to allow you to not to basically get off your game.
Yeah, compelled ingenuity, healthy free market competition, right?
Every time.
You know, you just reminded me of the thought of these clowns on Capitol Hill that beat up these big tech CEOs. And what are they going to do on their way home and when they get home that evening? They're going to use Google Maps to go meet someone for dinner. They're going to go home and they're going to talk to Alexa, and they're going to get on Facebook. But yet, it's exactly what you just mentioned a minute ago. They're attacking the things that they're using every day. If it's so bad, then how did it become so ubiquitous in terms of its place in the market? So we've talked about examples of bad regulation. Let me flip the table a little bit just so that we can, keep the analysis and our minds open here. And I'd like to share with you some thoughts in terms of what I think folks might be able to call and what I would argue would be limited examples of good regulation. Now, you and I have areas of disagreement and we have areas of agreement. The areas in which we agree are that we do not like a lot of government regulation. We both detest that, and I would say for good reason. There are two examples that I would raise under the limited category of good regulation coming from Washington. The first is the limited focus that's happening on Capitol Hill right now, led by, for example, Senators Klobuchar and Warner, on the so-called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, or what is just simply in shorthand known as Section 230. It's this unbelievably broad grant of immunity that's granted to big tech that's not granted to other people in the media space with respect to things that are pumped through their pipes on the internet. So if Twitter has folks that are fomenting actual hate or violence and or misinformation, they have absolute immunity under Section 230, and there are actions that are happening on Capitol Hill to take a very conservative, very restricted view of trying to tweak Section 230 only to the extent that a provider has notice of communications that are based on fake information that presents an imminent risk of harm. So if someone is on Twitter and they're saying that, God forbid, American Muslims are bad and we need to go out and we need to spark violence against Muslims or Asian Americans, which is just so terrible that happens. There are acts of violence. There are also acts of business fraud. The senators are saying that there should be limited changes to Section 230. I think that's a great idea. I think the idea of Facebook having no concerns or considerations of liability in that regard is just ridiculous. And the statute was written at the time that Mark Zuckerberg was 8. Just gives you an idea of how fast technology changes. The other category of what I would call good regulation, which again I think is pretty specific and limited, has to do with data protection and cybersecurity. We saw what happened with Colonial. We've seen what's happened with all kinds of hacks and breaches of data. Yahoo has had huge data breaches, and there have been pushes on Capitol Hill, and quite frankly, they've gone nowhere, to try to lock down data protection and cybersecurity because that's about protecting people. So my question is, do you think that there are some limited examples where some big tech regulation can be good regulation?
No, and I think you just explained.
Oh, well. Good night, everybody.
Yes. We can move on.
Okay. Next.
But I think you just explained why. Section 230, there's this myth out there that Section 230 was written to protect Twitter, Facebook, Amazon, and these big technology companies now. But as you note, it was written back when Mark Zuckerberg was 8.
Right.
And so that tells you something that it's wholly superfluous at this point. We need regulation, or this is protecting Facebook, or this is protecting Twitter. I think not. For a long while, Twitter's stock was in major decline because people didn't think it had much of a future. It failed in even acquiring LinkedIn because the view was that Twitter was just sort of on the path to average. Facebook, again, even in 2000, Mark Zuckerberg was still in high school. So let's assume a world without Section 230. Would somehow Facebook become more of a place for fake information or dangerous information or less? I don't think it would look any different. Right now, Facebook is regulating the content on its site because it has an incentive to. If it is seen as a purveyor of hate, if suddenly Facebook says, oh, we're protected by Section 230, say what you want in here, it doesn't matter to us, right, very quickly Facebook will head back toward irrelevance. And so to me, get rid of Section 230. Don't try to tweak what is superfluous in the first place.
Right.
And then in terms of cybersecurity, Ken Fisher always makes the point, and I bring him up here every so often, that capitalism will always outrun government. So we want a regulation to make sure to protect data. Oh, please. Who in government, if you're so good at protecting data, if you're so good at blocking cyber terrorists, or however we want to call them, you don't work in government. You're either a terrorist yourself or you're working in the private sector to protect it. So I think the idea that we need government to step in and give a bureaucracy even more of a purpose that it can't fulfill, right, doesn't excite me too much.
Well, I grant you that the effectiveness of Capitol Hill actually doing something on a national level about data protection and cybersecurity, it has been like watching an elephant try to thread a needle. They've been completely clueless. They give all these hypotheticals and speeches. The states have all taken their run at data protection and cybersecurity, and certainly while that's a good thing, here in Virginia there have been some big changes on that too. The problem is that when you step back and you look at on a national level, you have a patch quilt of 50 different laws, and Congress, with all of these breaches, including the SolarWinds hack by Russia, which of course they deny, but who cares because they were absolutely responsible. Those were breaches that were in the public and the private sector. That was not just an attack on Washington, D.C. That was an attack on the United States. And it would be difficult for anyone to argue me out of that. But there's no indication from Washington that they're going to have the focus or the alacrity to actually get anything done on that. The problem, in my view, is that if you don't have some very, very basic minimal standards, then you're going to rely on Mark Zuckerberg to actually mediate content and regulation in instances where the platform is being used for people to run in the middle of a congressionally mandated constitutional event where 5 people get slaughtered. we're in trouble if we're going to rely on Sheryl Sandberg and Mark Zuckerberg to do the right thing. And the last I looked, there is no do the right thing statute right now. So without some kind of minimal standards, that's very much an open question. Now, you correctly note that the capital markets and the free economy are always going to be more specialized on the substance and faster on the process to make something happen. The problem is that some of these issues do not become fully incentivized until they actually have their liability butt on the line. So we'll see in terms of where it goes. Let's close by talking about, we've talked about the president and we've talked about the ups and downs and the positives and negatives of government regulation on big tech. Where do you see this headed into the future? If when you look into your crystal ball, where do you see things headed over the next year or two on this front? Do you think, along the lines of your Forbes article, that the regulators are going to come in and spread around a healthy dose of mediocrity, or are they going to get out of the way? Where do you see this heading in the near and intermediate term?
Well, I'll answer the question by saying right now in China, if you just go on the basic internet and look up Tiananmen Square, you can't find it. But if you have any kind of computer skills in China, which a lot of them do, you can easily find all the information you want about Tiananmen. If you say something bad about Xi Jinping on the internet right now in China, the censors will get to it. But by the time they get to it, the information is already spread around. Again, technology is much, much quicker. And so I see government trying to get in the way because that's their nature. Where there's profit, government's always going to follow. And so big technology has a very difficult scenario. If they don't allow government in, they have what happened to Bill Gates happen to them. And so so you see that with Jeff Bezos and Amazon right now. Why did he buy the Washington Post? Oh, come on, we know why he bought it. And so this is going to continue. I'm not worried broadly that this won't solve itself, because you just said why it's going to solve itself. If we're going to rely on Mark Zuckerberg, we're in big trouble. But that speaks to the fact that we have not reached the frontier of social media, of information dissemination. Someone is going to innovate Mark Zuckerberg into the past, just as has always been the case in any dynamic industry. Mark Zuckerberg is not going to have a monopoly any more than AOL maintained its monopoly, or Yahoo, or Blockbuster at the time when it was viewed as a monopoly. This is going to be innovated away. Sadly, I think, though, that government, because it's going to force its way in, what choice does Zuckerberg have? I view him as a sympathetic figure. Do you think he wants this? Do you think he wants to have to say to President Obama that he's cool with higher taxes, or we would accept more regulation? What do you do when you're big rail or big tech, when if you don't kowtow, they can put you out of business very quickly? So I think we should view him as sympathetic, while always knowing that no matter what government does, someone's going to overtake him.
Right. Well, we'll agree to disagree on whether Mark Zuckerberg is sympathetic or not. I hear you, and I always respect everything that you have to say and write. I am not a big fan of Mark Zuckerberg. However, there's always going to be ingenuity and creativity in the marketplace, and I'd love to see more competition on Facebook. In terms of my take on the future, in terms of what's not going to work, the DOJ case against big tech in the federal court in the District of Columbia, asserting antitrust violations, will not work, because the very mergers that the government complains about, they approved. So those aren't going to go anywhere, and it's hard to imagine that Congress is going to go anywhere in any updates to the antitrust statute, even though it really hasn't changed since 1890, which is unbelievable. Things that I think are going to change due to pressure. I predict that there are going to be changes to Section 230. I think that the Senate's going to take the lead on that on Capitol Hill. I think there will be pressure for some kind of cybersecurity reform. There's just too much pressure right now, and cybersecurity became a really boring issue for a lot of people until about, I would say, maybe 2 weeks ago. I went out during the Dominion hack during that first weekend when there was a little bit of an indication of a shortage of gas. And I saw people that were getting into heated arguments and long lines at gas stations. And I thought to myself, you know what? People are going to start to think about, does cybersecurity really matter? It will if they lose their ability to get gas and they lose their ability to protect their personal identifying information. So it will be limited. It will be slow. Welcome to Washington. That's the way it always goes. But anyway, John, another great topic. Keep those great articles coming, and look forward to talking to you next time.
Yes.